I've spent my whole life in someone else's shadow, my brother's shadow. And what I didn't know back then was that one day he would use that shadow to steal the very life I built. If you love shocking betrayal and ultimate revenge stories, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the final twist. Growing up, Lucas was the star of the family. He had that easy smile, that confident stride, the kind of charm that made strangers open doors for him without a second thought. Teachers adored him even when he didn't turn in homework. Friends forgave him when he borrowed money and forgot to pay it back. And my parents, well, they let him slide on things they would have crucified me for. Me, I was the opposite. Quiet, careful, the kid who stayed up late doing project alone while Lucas snuck out to parties. I wasn't bad-looking, I wasn't unpopular, but next to Lucas, I might as well have been invisible. At family gatherings, relatives would pinch my cheek, tell me I was the responsible one, and then drift toward Lucas, the entertainer. I didn't envy his charm. What I envied, if I'm honest, was how he always managed to get away with everything. Like the time in high school when Lucas borrowed my laptop for a week. He crashed it downloading games, lost all my college essays, and shrugged it off with that grin that seemed to hypnotize everyone. Mom scolded him for 5 minutes. Dad gave a lecture about responsibility, and then it was forgotten. I was left rewriting essays from scratch at 3 in the morning. Or the time he took my car without asking, ran out of gas, and left it parked in some alley I had to walk half a mile to find. He didn't even apologize. He just said, "Relax, little brother. You're too uptight." It was always like that. Lucas made messes. I cleaned them up. But deep down, I learned something important from all of it. Lucas was reckless, but reckless people leave trails. At the time, I didn't know how important that lesson would be. After college, life took us in different directions. I found a decent job, not glamorous, but steady. The kind of work that required long hours, attention to detail, and patience. It suited me. Lucas, on the other hand, drifted. 1 month, he was selling used cars. The next, he was trying to flip houses, then chasing some get-rich-quick scheme online. Every time it fell apart, he landed back home with a story about how he'd been cheated, how he was this close to making it big. I try not to judge him. He was my brother. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that one day, his recklessness wouldn't just burn him, it would burn me too. And then little things started happening. A phone call from a bank, asking if I wanted to confirm an application for a new credit line. A letter in the mail with my name on it, but an address I didn't recognize. At first, I brushed it off. Banks make mistakes, I told myself. Mail gets mixed up. But the timing, it was strange. Each time something like that happened, Lucas was around more than usual. Popping up at the house, asking casual questions about my job, my pay, whether I'd ever considered investing. He always laughed it off like it was nothing, but I felt that old unease stirring in my gut. Still, I didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, I tried to focus on myself. I'd been saving, working toward stability. I wanted a life that wasn't dramatic or messy, just mine. But every time Lucas appeared with that too-wide grin, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was circling me somehow, like a hawk waiting for the right moment to swoop down. The last time I saw him that year, he slapped me on the back and said, "You don't know it yet, but you're going to thank me soon." I laughed it off, thinking it was just another one of his big, empty promises. But later that night, lying awake, those words kept echoing. Thank me soon. What could Lucas possibly do that I'd ever be grateful for? I didn't know it then, but those words were the first crack in the floor beneath me. The kind you don't notice until you're already falling. And Lucas, my brother, my shadow, was waiting at the bottom. They say trouble doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in like water, drop by drop, until the floor beneath you is soaked and ready to collapse. That's how it started with Lucas, small leaks in places I thought were solid. One morning, I got a call at work. It was the kind of call you don't want to get from a bank. "Mr. Carter," the woman said politely, "we just wanted to confirm the details on your loan application before we process it." Loan application? I nearly dropped the phone. I hadn't applied for any loan. I hadn't even considered one. My life was simple: rent, utilities, groceries, savings. I lived within my means because I had to. I think you have the wrong person, I told her. I didn't apply for anything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a keyboard clicking. Your name, your social security number, your employer, it all matches what's on file, she said, her voice tightening. I hung up before she could press further. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back. Was it a scam? Identity theft? Some clerical error? I wanted to believe it was nothing, but unease sat heavy in my chest. That evening, when I got home, Lucas was there, sprawled on the couch, feet on the coffee table, flipping through the channels like he lived there. I hadn't even known he was visiting our parents that week, but that was Lucas, showing up when he felt like it, disappearing just as quickly. Rough day, he asked, grinning. I studied him for a second too long. His hair slicked back, a shirt I didn't recognize, nicer than anything he usually wore. He looked smug. Just work? I muttered, brushing past him. Lucas followed me into the kitchen like a shadow. You ever think about loans? Investments? Big moves. The word stopped me cold. Why? I asked too quickly. He shrugged, too casual. Just wondering. You're the smart one, right? Got all figured out. Thought maybe you'd be looking at, I don't know, property, business ventures, something like that. I forced a laugh, but my stomach was twisting. The timing was too strange. The call that morning. Now this. I'm fine where I am, I said, pulling open the fridge just to have something to look at. Lucas smirked. Suit yourself. But don't be surprised if life takes a turn soon. There it was again, that cryptic tone he'd used before, like he knew something I didn't. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation. The call. His words. His grin. Life takes a turn soon. I tried to shake it off, but the next week, another letter came in the mail. My name on the envelope, but the address was for an apartment I'd never even heard of. Inside, a welcome packet for a new lease agreement. My pulse quickened as I read it. The lease wasn't in Lucas's name. It was in mine. The handwriting on the signature line was jagged, uneven, close enough to pass at a glance, but I recognized the slant, the rushed curve of the letters. It was Lucas's hand. I felt sick. I wanted to confront him right then, but I stopped myself. Lucas had a way of twisting things, of laughing them off until I doubted my own sanity. I could already hear his voice. Relax, little brother. You worry too much. So instead, I kept the letter, slipped it into a folder. I didn't know why, but instinct told me to hold on to it. And when 2 weeks later, another call came, this time about a car purchase I had supposedly made, I knew this wasn't some random scammer. This was Lucas. But the real question wasn't if he was doing it. The question was why. Because Lucas never played the long game. He was impulsive, reckless. Fraud, fake leases, loans, that wasn't his style. Too much work, too much planning. So what was he building toward? I didn't know it then, but the answer was already circling me. And Lucas, my own brother, was waiting for the right moment to close in. By the time the third call came, I couldn't deny it anymore. Mr. Carter, the voice on the phone, said, "We just need to verify your employment before we finalize the purchase agreement on your new vehicle." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "I didn't purchase a car," I said slowly. Silence. Then the woman repeated, "But the paperwork has your name, your signature, your address. The down payment's already been made." I hung up before she could go on. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd be sick. This wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger halfway across the world with a stolen credit card number. Whoever was doing this knew me, my job, my details, my habits. And I knew who it was. Lucas. The problem was knowing it and proving it were two very different things. That night, I went through every scrap of suspicious mail I'd collected over the past month. The lease agreement. The loan inquiry. Now this car purchase. Different businesses, different details, but all with my name, my information. And every single signature looked just close enough to mine to pass. But to me, it was obvious. The rushed, sloppy curve of the C. The way the T crossed too high. Lucas always signed fast, like he couldn't be bothered to slow down. And he was careless, sloppy enough to think nobody would notice. He must have gotten hold of my ID somehow. Maybe he'd copied documents when I wasn't paying attention. Maybe he'd found a way into my files. The thought made my stomach churn. The next day, I took a half day off work and drove downtown to the leasing office listed on the letter. I told them I was there to ask about my rental. The woman at the desk looked up at me with polite confusion. "Oh, you must be Mr. Carter. I met you last week." My blood ran cold. She thought she'd already met me. I forced a smile. "Could you describe when that was?" She clicked around on her computer, then pulled up a file. "Here we go. Your brother helped you move in, didn't he? He signed as the guarantor on some of the paperwork. Nice guy. Look a lot like you." I nodded tightly, barely able to keep my composure. "Right. Of course." When I walked back to my car, my hands were shaking. Lucas wasn't just using my name. He was showing up in person, pretending to be me. Smiling, talking, shaking hands with people who believed they were dealing with me. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers ached. It was one thing to play around with loans or mail. But this was different. He wasn't just borrowing my life. He was living it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk with my laptop, scouring through every account I had. Bank, email, phone records. And there it was, strange logins I didn't recognize. Out of place, charges I never made. Applications submitted at times I was asleep. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Lucas had been collecting pieces of me for months, and I hadn't even noticed. The final confirmation came a week later. I was walking home from work when I saw him across the street. Lucas, dressed in a fitted blazer, polished shoes, carrying himself like a man who belonged in places he'd never set foot in before. And he wasn't alone. A man in a suit shook his hand, laughing at something Lucas said. A woman in a pencil skirt nodded politely, handing him a business card. And through it all, Lucas smiled, that perfect smile, the one that always opened doors. But it wasn't just Lucas they saw. It was me, because I heard him introduce himself, loud and clear, across the noise of the street. "Ethan Carter," he said. "My name, my life, my face." I froze on the sidewalk, watching as the man clapped him on the back, as the woman smiled, as Lucas slid the business card into his pocket like he'd earned it. And in that moment, I understood. Lucas wasn't pretending to be me in secret anymore. He was wearing my identity like a suit, showing it off to the world. The worst part? People believed him. When he turned to cross the street, our eyes locked. For a split second, his grin faltered. Then he winked at me, a casual, taunting little wink that said, "What are you going to do about it, little brother?" I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. I didn't have the answer yet. But I knew one thing. I was done being silent. Lucas thought he was clever, that he could live my life better than I could. But he didn't realize I'd already started watching, documenting, collecting. And sooner or later, I'd make sure the life he stole collapsed right on top of him. If Lucas stealing my name had been just about money, maybe I could have found a way to stop it quietly. A lawyer, a police report, something simple, clean. But then she entered the picture. Her name was Eleanor Wexler. I first heard it in passing from a coworker who mentioned she was back in town after spending years abroad. "Old money," he said, lowering his voice like it was a secret. "The kind of family that doesn't buy houses, they buy blocks of property. She's probably here to take over part of the family estate." I didn't think much of it at the time. Wealthy families like hers lived in a completely different orbit from mine. I was never going to cross paths with her. At least I thought so. A week later, I spotted Lucas again. This time, he wasn't shaking hands with businessmen. He was sitting at an outdoor cafe, leaning across the table, his smile turned up to its highest wattage. And sitting opposite him was a woman I recognized instantly from the society pages my mother used to obsess over. Eleanor Wexler. She was the kind of woman people described in hushed tones. Graceful posture, expensive taste, but an aura of sharpness that suggested she wasn't some shallow socialite. She was watching Lucas closely as he spoke, her expression balanced somewhere between amusement and intrigue. I froze in place, hidden behind a lamppost like some stalker. I didn't need to hear the words to know how he'd introduced himself. He wasn't Lucas Carter. Not here. Not to her. He was me, Ethan Carter, the responsible one, the hard worker, the man with a stable job, clean records, and a life that screamed trustworthy. Everything Lucas wasn't. Everything he'd stolen from me. I felt my chest tighten as I watched Eleanor laugh at something he said, her hand brushing against his across the table. Lucas leaned in closer, his body language rehearsed, perfect. For the first time, the betrayal burned deeper than anger. It wasn't just fraud anymore. Lucas was playing with someone's life. A woman who clearly had no idea who she was really sitting across from. And worse, he was dragging my name into it. I walked away before they could see me, but the image of them together burned in my mind. All weekend, it gnawed at me. I knew Lucas. I knew his patterns. He wasn't interested in Eleanor herself. He was interested in her wealth, her connections, her power. He saw her as a golden ticket. And to cash it, he'd use my identity as collateral. That thought made me sick. I started digging. Late at night, I scoured social media, news articles, even financial reports about the Wexler family. Eleanor was the only daughter of a reclusive heiress who controlled a vast portfolio of real estate and investments. Rumor had it Eleanor's mother was strict, cold, impossible to impress. Suitors were vetted like applicants for a top-secret job. Lucas wouldn't stand a chance as himself. But as me? As Ethan Carter, steady, dependable, with a spotless background, he'd pass through the gates easily. And if Eleanor truly fell for him, then my stolen name would be tied not just to a few shady loans or a forged lease, but to a family worth millions. That was when I realized the scale of what Lucas was doing. It wasn't just identity theft. It was a con, a long game, and I was the mask he was wearing to play it. The next time I saw them was at a charity gala. I hadn't been invited, of course. I was nowhere near that world. But a client at work mentioned it, and something in my gut told me Lucas would be there. So I went, not inside, just outside, lurking in the shadows across the street as expensive cars rolled up to the entrance and men in tuxedos escorted glittering women past photographers. And then I saw him. Lucas. My suit. My name. My stolen life. And on his arm, Eleanor Wexler, radiant in a sapphire gown that shimmered under the lights. She looked proud, confident, completely at ease with the man beside her. The cameras flashed. Photographers shouted my name. Ethan Carter. Ethan Carter. But the man they were calling to wasn't me. It was him. My brother. In that moment, something inside me hardened. Lucas thought he was invincible, that he could charm his way into Eleanor's world, use my identity to build himself a throne, and laugh while I watched from the shadows. But what he didn't know was that every step he took deeper into this lie was another piece of evidence I was collecting. And when the time came, I wouldn't just expose him. I'd make sure the empire he was trying to build came crashing down right on top of him. The first time I saw my name in the society column, it didn't feel real. Ethan Carter and Eleanor Wexler spotted at the Wexler Foundation Gala. Sources say the pair appeared quite close, sparking rumors of a budding romance. There was in black and white. My name. My face in blurry photographs, though the man smiling with Eleanor wasn't me. It was Lucas. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. My chest tightened like a vice. It was official now. Lucas wasn't just wearing my life in private. He'd introduced it to the world, and the world believed him. My mother clipped the article, called me in a rush, her voice almost shrill. Ethan, why didn't you tell us? Eleanor Wexler, do you have any idea what this could mean? I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, to scream it into the phone, but the words stuck in my throat. She wouldn't believe me. Not against Lucas. She never had. So I said nothing. I let her gush about my bright future, my unbelievable luck, my charm she'd always claimed to see. All the while, my brother was the one she was praising. The silence felt like swallowing glass. I started watching closer. Not in a desperate way, but carefully, deliberately. Every photo, every article, every social media post Eleanor's friends made. I collected them all. Lucas was smart enough not to flood the internet with his new life, but Eleanor's circle wasn't as careful. A dinner here, a fundraiser there, a blurry snapshot of him leaning against Eleanor's car, sunglasses perched on his face like he belonged in that world. Each image was another nail in the coffin he was building. But the hardest part wasn't collecting the evidence. It was watching him succeed. At a garden charity event, I stood far enough from the hedges that nobody would notice me. Just another nameless face among the staff cleaning up. And there he was, Lucas, wearing my suit, my smile, telling stories I recognized from my life. Back when I was at university, he said, his voice carrying over the clinking of glasses, I work part-time just to make ends meet. Built character. That's what I always tell myself. Eleanor laughed softly, touching his arm with a look that made my stomach twist. He was feeding her pieces of my history, weaving it into his narrative like it belonged to him. Her mother was there, too. A severe woman with silver hair, pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her face. She was known for being impossible to impress, but she was nodding at Lucas's words, her sharp eyes softened by approval. Approval I'd never once seen directed at me. That's when the fear struck. If Eleanor and he, our mother, fully accepted him as me, how far would this go? Marriage? A new life built entirely on my stolen name? It felt like I was being erased, piece by piece. The temptation to confront him grew unbearable. I wanted to walk up in the middle of one of those events, drag him into the spotlight, and scream the truth. But that would have been foolish. Lucas was too good at spinning lies. In a public setting, he'd laugh, clap me on the back, and say I was jealous. People would believe him. They always had. No, if I wanted to bring him down, I had to wait. I had to be precise. So I played the part I'd always played, the invisible brother, the one who cleaned up the mess in silence. Only this time I wasn't cleaning. I was building something. Every lease agreement, every forged document, every photo, every slip of his handwriting, every article that tied Ethan Carter to actions that weren't mine. Even the recordings I'd started making, like the one where Lucas called me late at night, his voice slurred from drinking. Bro, he'd said with a laugh, you should be thanking me. I'm making your name worth something. You never knew how to use it. I saved that recording 3 times. Because one day, it would be the dagger I drove straight through the image he'd built. Weeks passed. Lucas's hold on Eleanor only grew tighter. They were inseparable now, photographed walking arm in arm through the city, dining in restaurants I couldn't afford to glance at, attending galas where his name was spoken with respect. My name. It burned to watch. To see him living a version of the life I could never touch, wearing it like it was his by right. But beneath the anger, something colder was taking root. Patience. Because the higher Lucas climbed, the further he had to fall. And I would be the one waiting at the bottom, ready to cut the rope. It was one thing to see my brother smiling in photographs with Eleanor. It was another to see him standing at the head of her family's dining table, carving roast lamb like he'd been born into their world. I wasn't supposed to be there. Of course not. But when you're desperate enough, invisible enough, you learn how to linger at the edges of a life that isn't yours. That night, I was standing on the gravel drive of the Wexler estate, hidden behind a row of manicured hedges. From there, I could see through the wide glass windows into their dining room, where Lucas sat in my place. Literally my place. Introduced as Ethan Carter. Trusted. Welcomed. Eleanor sat beside him, laughing at something he'd said. Her mother, stern, sharp-eyed Mrs. Wexler, sat across, nodding with approval as Lucas spoke with practiced confidence. It was surreal, like watching a theater production of my life, only I'd never auditioned, never agreed to be part of the cast. Lucas was performing me, down to the little details he'd stolen. My work history, my habits, even my favorite book, which I heard him mention once when Eleanor asked about literature. He's quoting me. I whispered bitterly to myself in the shadows. He's quoting my life. The sting was unbearable. But as I watched, something shifted. Lucas was too smooth, too polished. I knew that version of him. It was the version that never lasted. Because Lucas couldn't help himself. Eventually, he always cracked, and I started to see it. A flicker in his eyes when Mrs. Wexler asked a question about his career. A stumble in his story when Eleanor mentioned a past trip that required specifics. His charm covered it well, but I recognized the signs. Lucas wasn't used to details. He was used to broad strokes, fast lies, the kind that vanished before anyone had time to ask follow-up questions. Here, though, Eleanor's family was too sharp, too practiced in the games of wealth and power. They would notice eventually, if I let them. The next day, an article appeared online. Ethan Carter seen advising Wexler Foundation on real estate ventures. I stared at the headline, bile rising in my throat. Lucas wasn't just dining at their table anymore. He was sitting in their meetings, playing expert, using my name to gain influence I could never dream of. And people were eating it up. But I also noticed something the reporters didn't. The numbers in the article didn't add up. They quoted me, on investment strategies that didn't make sense. Ideas that sounded good, but had holes big enough to drive a truck through. Lucas was overreaching. That was his flaw. Always had been. He could charm his way into a room, but he could never keep the doors open forever. And if I was patient enough, I could catch the moment when the doors slammed shut. That week, I got a surprise. Eleanor reached out to me. Not directly. She thought she was contacting Lucas, of course. But the message landed in one of my old email accounts he must not have realized I still had access to. Ethan, she wrote, I wanted to thank you again for last night. My mother hasn't warmed to anyone this quickly in years. She trusts you, and that means I can too. I know you've been careful, but you don't have to be with me. I sat staring at the screen for nearly an hour. Her words weren't for me, but they cut into me all the same. She believed him. She trusted him. She thought she was finally seeing the real me. And yet, buried in those words, I saw something else, an opening. If Eleanor was writing him directly, it meant she wanted honesty, connection, and Lucas wasn't capable of giving that for long. It was only a matter of time before he slipped, and when he did, I'd be ready to show her who he really was. I began tightening my net. Every article, every contract, every false statement he made in her family's name, I archived it all. I even managed to get a hold of one of the foundation's newsletters through a public mailing list. There, plain as day, was a statement attributed to Ethan Carter about economic forecasts. A statement I knew Lucas hadn't written, because the phrasing was too close to something I'd once written for work. He wasn't just borrowing from my life anymore. He was plagiarizing it outright. And that, I realized, was his fatal mistake. Because if he was stealing my words, my ideas, my history, then I had the perfect weapon. Proof. Proof that the man Eleanor thought she loved wasn't real. Proof that my brother wasn't Ethan Carter. He was a stranger in my skin. And sooner or later, I'd rip the mask off in front of everyone. For months, I'd watched Lucas live a life that wasn't his. My name on invitations. My face in photographs. My history turned into cocktail party stories. He had everything. Eleanor's hand on his arm, her mother's guarded approval, and the city's admiration. But the higher he climbed, the more I saw it. The little cracks in the mask he wore. The first one came at a luncheon hosted by the Wexler Foundation. I hadn't been invited, of course, but I had grown accustomed to watching from the shadows. It was a habit now, slipping in unnoticed, listening at the edges, memorizing the moments nobody else thought twice about. The luncheon was a modest affair by their standards. Crisp linens, chilled champagne, the city's most powerful men and women gathered under one roof. Lucas stood at the podium, speaking on behalf of the foundation. My name carried on his tongue, smooth as silk. But then someone asked a question. Mr. Carter, given your background in finance, how do you see inflation affecting the housing market over the next 2 years? A simple question. A softball, really. And Lucas froze. I knew that look. Tight jaw, darting eyes, the faint sheen of sweat. He didn't know the answer. He laughed it off at first, made a joke, tried to charm his way through. Well, I don't want to bore you with too many numbers, he said. But let's just say, I believe in people, not charts. The audience chuckled politely, but I saw Mrs. Wexler's expression tighten. Eleanor leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Lucas stumbled through the rest of his speech, his charm carrying him just enough to survive. But it wasn't smooth, not flawless like he wanted it to be, and when he stepped down, I caught the flicker of panic in his eyes before Eleanor looped her arm through his and whispered something reassuring. He was cracking. That night, I sat at my desk with the recording I'd made of his speech. I replayed the moment he froze, the joke he used to cover it, over and over. And I smiled, because this was it, the beginning of his downfall. Lucas had always been reckless, always thought his charm could shield him. But in a world built on details, charm only lasted so long. And the moment people began to question him, they'd start digging. And when they dug, they'd find me. A week later, another slip, this time at Eleanor's estate. I wasn't there in person, but through one of Eleanor's friends' posts online, I saw it unfold. A photo of Lucas at the piano, Eleanor beside him, captioned, "Didn't know Ethan was so musically talented." Except Lucas wasn't. I was. I'd taken lessons for years. Lucas had quit after 3 months. And sure enough, the comments told the story. He only played for a minute. Seemed like he was struggling. Still charming, though. Charming. Always charming. But not convincing. Eleanor didn't notice. Not yet. Love, or what she thought was love, had a way of smoothing over inconsistencies. But Mrs. Wexler? I caught her in the background of one of the photos, watching Lucas with narrowed eyes. She was starting to see it too. That was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to expose him yet. Not while Eleanor still believed. Not while her mother was still unsure. No, I was going to let Lucas keep building. Let him tighten the rope around his own neck. But I was going to prepare my stage. I started reaching out quietly. A journalist I knew from college. Someone who still owed me a favor. A contact at the bank who'd hinted they weren't convinced all the signatures they'd seen recently were authentic. Even a lawyer, a friend, who specialized in fraud cases. I didn't tell them everything. Not yet. But I planted seeds. Because when the time came, I didn't want Lucas to just fall. I wanted him to implode. The final crack came 2 weeks later. I saw it with my own eyes. Lucas was walking with Eleanor outside a gallery opening. Paparazzi followed, flashes exploding in the night. He was smiling, waving, pulling her close like the perfect gentleman. And then, just for a second, he slipped. One of the photographers called out my name. "Ethan, over here." Lucas turned, and his face twisted. Not into a smile, not into charm, into irritation, into the real Lucas. It lasted only a second before he plastered the grin back on. But the cameras caught it, and the next morning, the photos were online. Side by side, Lucas grinning in one shot, his mask slipping in the next. The caption read, "Ethan Carter, charming or cracking?" I clipped the article, added it to my growing archive. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt it. The tide was turning. When I first saw the headline, I thought it had to be a mistake. Ethan Carter seen shopping for rings with Eleanor Wexler. My name, my life, staring back at me in glossy print, wrapped around a lie so large it made my chest ache. I knew Lucas was bold, reckless. But marriage? This wasn't just theft anymore. This was erasure. If he married Eleanor under my name, his lie wouldn't just be a performance. It would be permanent. And me? Idevanish. I read the article 3 times over, each word stabbing deeper. Witnesses had seen me with Eleanor and an upscale jeweler, laughing with the staff, slipping her hand into his. There were even photos, grainy but undeniable. Lucas, holding Eleanor's hand, examining rings that glittered under the lights. It should have been impossible. It should have been me. But it wasn't. It was never me. The night after the article came out, I drove past the Wexler estate. Lights glowed warmly from the windows. Music drifted faintly into the night. Through the tall iron gates, I caught a glimpse of Lucas on the balcony with Eleanor. She leaned into him, smiling, her laughter floating down like smoke. My brother was about to marry her. And the worst part? Nobody doubted him. Not Eleanor. Not the staff. Not the society pages that ate up every photo of them together. The only person who doubted him was Mrs. Wexler. I could see it in her eyes whenever she was captured in the background of those photos. Sharp, calculating, skeptical. She didn't trust easily, and she didn't trust completely now. That was the crack I needed. I began to move more deliberately. The folder I'd been building for months, documents, forged signatures, recordings, was no longer just insurance. It was a weapon. I reached back out to the journalist who owed me a favor. Sent him one document. Just one. The forged lease agreement with my name scribbled in Lucas's hand. I didn't say much, just, "Ever wondered if the man you're writing about is who he says he is?" The reply came within an hour. "You'd better have more than this." I smiled grimly. Oh, I had more. But not yet. Not until the right moment. Meanwhile, Lucas grew bolder. At another gala, I watched from across the street as he clinked glasses with Eleanor, announcing loudly to their circle of friends that the next chapter of their lives was about to begin. The crowd erupted in cheers, Eleanor blushing, her mother's lips pressed thin but silent. The rumors spread fast. Engagement was inevitable. The Wexler heiress and the respectable, steady Ethan Carter, a match made in headlines. But I saw what they didn't. Lucas's hands shaking slightly when he raised his glass, the sweat gathering at his collar. The way he fumbled a detail when someone asked about his university days. He was unraveling under the weight of his own lie. And soon he'd collapse. 2 nights later, I got proof. Eleanor sent an email, again to the wrong account Lucas had set up in my name. Ethan, mother has questions. She asked about your family history, and you seemed vague. I defended you, but please be honest with me. I need to know everything before we move forward. I read it 3 times, my pulse hammering. She was doubting him, doubting me. If Lucas couldn't answer her questions, if he slipped even once, Eleanor would start pulling at the threads. And when she did, the entire mask would tear away. That same night, Lucas called me. Not to confess, not to apologize, to gloat. You see the papers, little brother, he said, his voice dripping with smugness. I told you you'd thank me someday. I'm about to marry into a family that will change everything. And they think I'm you. Isn't that perfect? I gripped the phone so hard I thought it might crack. You're digging your own grave, Lucas. He laughed, a full, careless laugh. Maybe, but at least I'll be rich when I'm buried. And then he hung up. I stared at the silent phone, my hand trembling. Not with fear this time, but with resolve. Because now, I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to stop the proposal. I was going to let it happen. I was going to let Lucas stand in front of Eleanor, in front of her mother, in front of everyone who believed him. And then, when his lie was at its highest, I would cut the rope and watch him fall. It was the kind of night my family had never been invited to, not even once. Crystal chandeliers, waiters in white gloves, strings playing softly in the background while the city's elite mingled over champagne. And yet, my name was on the guest list. Not me, of course. Him, Lucas. I stood outside the ballroom, half hidden in the shadows, watching as photographers swarmed the couple of the night. Eleanor Wexler and Ethan Carter. My brother, my blood, my thief. He was glowing, drunk on attention, pulling Eleanor close as the cameras flashed. Her hand rested delicately on his chest, her smile radiant. She believed him. She believed me. But Mrs. Wexler didn't. I saw her in the corner, her sharp eyes never leaving Lucas. She clapped politely. She smiled when necessary. But her gaze was like a knife pressed against his throat. And then it happened. Lucas raised a glass, his grin wider than I'd ever seen. Friends, family, honored guests. He began, his voice loud enough to silence the room. Tonight, I want to share something personal. Something extraordinary. He took Eleanor's hand, lifted it into the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the diamond on her finger caught the glow of the chandeliers. I asked this incredible woman to be my wife, he announced. And she said yes. The room erupted in cheers. Glasses clinked. Congratulations poured in. Eleanor blushed as Lucas kissed her hand. And my name, was toasted across the ballroom. To Ethan Carter. The sound was like nails on glass inside my skull. I left before the applause died down. I couldn't watch them celebrate a life that wasn't his. Not when I knew how hollow it was. But as I drove home, the anger simmering inside me turned into something colder, sharper. This was it. Lucas had tied the rope. He'd placed the noose around his own neck. All I had to do was pull. The next morning, the papers were everywhere. Wexler heiress engaged to rising star Ethan Carter. There were photos of Lucas kneeling in front of Eleanor, slipping the ring onto her finger. Photos of Mrs. Wexler's tight smile, of Eleanor's radiant joy, of Lucas soaking in the spotlight like it was sunlight. And then, buried in the back pages, another article. Financial experts questioned Carter's statements at recent luncheon. It was small, a whisper compared to the roar of the engagement. But it was there, doubt, a crack, and I knew exactly how to widen it. I called the journalist. It's time, I said. He hesitated. Do you have enough? I opened the folder on my desk, the weight of months of quiet work pressing against me. Forgeries, contracts, leases, bank statements, recordings, even emails Eleanor had accidentally sent my way. Evidence of Lucas scrambling to cover details he didn't understand. Oh, I have more than enough, I told him. There was silence, then a low whistle. If this is real, it's going to blow up the city. That's the idea, I said. But I didn't stop there. I made another call to Mrs. Wexler. She didn't answer, of course. Women like her didn't pick up the phone for strangers. But I left a message. Careful, precise. Mrs. Wexler, the man engaged to your daughter, is not who he claims to be. He is not Ethan Carter. I am. I left no number, no name. Just enough to plant the seed. Because by the time she looked into it, by the time the journalist released the story, she would know the truth. And Lucas would have nowhere left to hide. That night, Lucas called me. You see the news, little brother? He sneered. Front page. The Wexlers are mine now. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. I let him talk, let him gloat. His arrogance spilled through the line like poison. You think you've won, I said softly when he finally paused. But you've forgotten something. He laughed. What's that? I smiled to myself, though he couldn't see it. The higher you climb, the further you fall. He scoffed, hung up. But my words weren't for him. They were for me. Because I knew tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. And Lucas Carter would be finished. The night the world decided who I was, I stood in the back and watched my brother disintegrate. They chose the engagement party for the reveal. Maybe that was theatrical. Maybe it was cruel. Either way, it was perfect. The Wexler Ballroom was a glass and crystal cathedral that could swallow anyone whole and spit them out cleaned and polished. Tonight, it was full of people who believed in status, stories, and the curated truth. Lucas walked in like a king, my name on his tongue, a ring glittering on Eleanor's hand, applause following him like a shadow. Everything was staged for joy. Photographers circled. Friends lifted flutes. Eleanor's laugh fluttered through the room, oblivious and radiant. I stood near a marble pillar at the back, a nameless silhouette, my hands shoved into my coat pockets so nobody would guess how tight I was holding them. The journalist I'd nudged had called earlier, voice low and urgent. We go live at 9. Be where you can see. I thanked him and told him I would be there. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. 9 o'clock came with a hush. Lucas mounted the dais. Handsome, practiced, the perfect version of my life he'd stolen. He raised his glass and began to speak, the room leaning in to drink in what he would say. Then the lights dimmed. It started as a ripple of confusion. Projectors at the far end of the room came alive, and the large screens, meant for slideshow photos of the couple, flickered. Instead of carefully posed images, the first slide read, in stark black type, Evidence, Ethan Carter, a false identity. The room went quiet enough that you could hear the chandeliers breathe. The first document scrolled up, a lease agreement with my name and a signature that could have been traced to Lucas's hurry. The next slide was a bank inquiry showing the applications filed in my name. Then a clip, my brother, on a phone call I'd recorded months ago, laughing drunkenly, admitting, I'm better at being Ethan than Ethan is. Gasps. The murmur that swelled felt like a second heartbeat. Eleanor's eyes found the screen. For half a second, disbelief softened her features. Then the color drained from her face. Mrs. Wexler's hand tightened into a fist, the knuckles white against her glove. Lucas laughed, too loud, too forced. What is this? He barked, eyes darting, trying to locate the source. He scanned the crowd for the journalist, for anyone to accuse, for a stagehand to blame. He could not find me. That's when Mrs. Wexler stood. She walked up the dais with the slow, unemotional grace of someone used to commanding rooms. When she reached the front, she held a slim envelope. This came to me anonymously, she said, her voice ice. Documents, recordings, and a note identifying the sender only as the man whose name you've stolen. The camera zoomed. The crowd shifted. Lucas's face went something like pale and then flint. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She folded the papers and laid them on the lectern like a verdict. Explain this, she said, not to the crowd, but to him. For a moment, he tried to charm. Mother, I swear, he began. The rehearsed cadence of lies faltered. He stammered about miscommunications, about jealous brothers, about mistakes. Every excuse was smaller than the document that had just been projected across the ballroom. The journalist, my ally, stepped forward then, calm and pitiless. He produced more. Emails Eleanor had mistakenly sent to a backup account. Press clippings showing contradictions in Lucas's claimed history. A comparison of signatures. He had my folder. He had the proof I'd collected. He had the one-time, anonymous tip I'd sent him and the rest of the stack I'd been saving for the exact moment Lucas's life looked most irreversible. People started to talk over one another. Some called for the Wexler staff to remove him. Others stood in stunned silence, eyes skipping between the screens and Lucas's face as if the two images couldn't be reconciled. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't faint. She looked at him as if she were reading a translation of a language she thought she'd known. Is this true? She asked, voice thin. Lucas's mouth opened. No words came. He tried to step toward her, but the room had become a ring of invisible glass. Mrs. Wexler reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed with a pressure that was almost maternal, almost protective. Then she looked at Lucas and said, quietly, with a chill that cut through the din, "Get out." He didn't have to be told twice. He stumbled off the dais like a man who'd lost balance on a stage. Paparazzi who'd come to photograph bliss instead photographed the exit of a liar. In the doorway, one of his friends, someone who'd been filmed celebrating with him the night before, crossed his arms and walked away. No one followed. I stood there and watched the world rearrange itself around a truth I had set free. There was no dramatic confession, no courtroom collapse, just a slow recognition in 100 faces, the way people bend when the foundation under their faith is removed. After they cleared the ballroom and the guests filtered out, murmuring and whispering, I slipped into the hallway. I didn't want Eleanor to see me. I didn't want Mrs. Wexler to know I'd been the ghost who handed them the scalpel. A few nights later, the city did the rest. Contracts were reviewed, engagements were postponed, investments were paused, legal notices were sent. Lucas called from a burner phone, voice raw and smaller than it had ever been. He begged. He threatened. He pleaded. I stayed silent. Silence was my weapon now, cold, precise, irrevocable. He tried to rebuild in the coming months, but without my name, without the cushion of the image he'd stolen, he had nowhere to land. The company that had once published flattering pieces about Ethan Carter rescinded an offer. The Wexlers issued a brief, formal statement. We regret the misunderstanding and will be conducting a full review of our vetting processes. Sometimes I thought of confronting him directly, of watching the man who had worn my life try to explain himself face to face. But when I pictured it, his eyes, the fear now permanent there, I felt nothing but a cool, satisfied clarity. Revenge, when done right, doesn't need theatrics. It needs timing. It needs patience. It needs the certainty that the person who takes from you will have nothing left to lose when the world turns on them. I kept my anonymity. I kept the recordings. I kept the documents. And I kept my life. Months later, the story became a cautionary footnote in society columns. How a charming imposter had tried to climb a ladder of other people's trust and fallen when the ladder collapsed. Lucas moved between odd jobs and cheap apartments. A cautionary tale of charisma without substance. Eleanor retreated into her world, bruised but guarded, and built firmer gates. As for me, people called me courageous occasionally when the story settled. Friends I told only in whispers congratulated me for doing the right thing. My parents wanted to talk, to reconcile, to understand why I'd waited. I met their eyes and found the same strange mixture of relief and regret that had hung over the Wexler ballroom after the lights went out. I never felt triumphant. Triumph is loud. What I felt was quieter, restored. The name that had been stripped from me was no longer a coat someone else wore. It felt at last truly mine. If this story gripped you, don't forget, there are more stories where this came from. Subscribe to Classic Revenge, drop a like, and tell me in the comments which moment you'd have exposed first. Your support keeps these tales alive. Shout out to Mike from New York City.